Okay, welcome back to Regaining the Balance. This is Matt speaking, and we're going to be doing an audio book of Carl Jung's Psychology and Religion, East and West, which I think is a fascinating book. Guy was a very brilliant man, and I think he's got some really interesting insights that he can share with us. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this because this is going to be a long read. So, let me share the screen here. And please like, share, and subscribe. If you guys enjoyed the video and the content. Here we go. So, the table of contents, we're going to be reading Part 1, Western Religion, Psychology and Religion, originally published in English, the Terry Lectures of 1937. So, this does come from lectures themselves. So, let us get to the first part here. Okay. Okay, so let me take a quick drink and get this thing started. Like I said, we're going to be here for a while. So part 1, which I believe is just called Psychology and Religion. So, the autonomy of the unconscious. As it seems to be the intention of the founder of the Terry Lectures to enable representatives of science as well as philosophy and other spheres of human knowledge to contribute to the discussion of the eternal problem of religion, since Yale University has bestowed upon me the great honor of delivering the Terry Lectures for 1937, I assume that it will be my task to show that psychology, or rather that special branch of medical psychology which I represent, has to do with or say about religion. Since religion is incontestably one of the earliest and most universal expressions of the human mind, it is obvious that any psychology which touches upon the psychological structure of human personality cannot avoid taking note of the fact that religion is not only a sociological and historical phenomenon, but also something of considerable personal concern to a great number of individuals. Although I have often been called a philosopher, I am an empiricist and adhere as such to the phenomenological standpoint. I trust that it does not conflict with the principles of scientific empiricism if one occasionally makes certain reflections which go beyond a mere accumulation and classification of experience. As a matter of fact, I believe that experience is not even possible without reflection because, quote-unquote, experience is a process of assimilation without which there could be no understanding. As the statement indicates, I approach psychological matters from a scientific and not from a philosophical standpoint. Inasmuch as religion has a very important psychological aspect, I deal with it from a purely empirical point of view. That is, I restrict myself to the observation of phenomena and I eschew any metaphysical or philosophical considerations. I do not deny the validity of these other considerations, but I cannot claim to be competent to apply them correctly. I'm aware that most people believe they know all there is to be known about psychology because they think that psychology is nothing but what they know of themselves. But I am afraid psychology is a good deal more than that. While having little to do with philosophy, it has much to do with the empirical facts, many of which are not easily accessible to the experience of the average man. It is my intention to give you a few glimpses of the way in which practical psychology comes up against the problem of religion. It is self-evident that the vastness of the problem requires far more than 3 lectures, as the necessary elaboration of concrete detail takes a great deal of time in explanation. My first lecture will be a sort of introduction to the problem of practical psychology and religion. The second is concerned with facts which demonstrate the existence of authentic religious function in the unconscious. The third deals with the religious symbolism of unconscious processes. Since I am going to present a rather unusual argument, I cannot assume that my audience will be fully acquainted with the methodological standpoint of the branch of psychology I represent. This standpoint is exclusively phenomenological. That is, it is concerned with occurrences, events, experiences in word with facts. Its truth is a fact and not a judgment. When psychology speaks, for instance, of the motif of the virgin birth, it is only concerned with the fact that there is such an idea, but it is not concerned with the question whether such an idea is true or false in any other sense. The idea is psychologically true in as much as it exists. Psychological existence is subjective insofar as an idea occurs in only one individual, but it is objective so far as that idea is shared by a society, by a consensus gentium. This point of view is the same as that of natural science. Psychology deals with ideas and other mental contents as zoology, for instance, deals with the different species of animals. An elephant is true because it exists. An elephant is neither an inference or a statement nor the subjective judgment of a creator. It is a phenomenon. But we are so used to the idea that psychic events are willfully and arbitrarily products or even the inventions of a human creator that we can hardly rid ourselves of the prejudiced view that the psyche and its contents are nothing but our own arbitrary invention or the more or less illusory product of supposition and judgment. The fact is that certain ideas exist almost everywhere and at all times and can even spontaneously create themselves quite independently of migration and tradition. This is true. Pardon me. They are not made by the individual just as an individual, they just happen to him. They even force themselves on his consciousness. This is not Platonic philosophy, but an empirical psychology. In speaking of religion, I must make clear from the start that I mean what I mean by that term, religion. As the Latin word denotes, it is careful and scrupulous observation of what Rudolf Otto aptly termed the numinosum, that is, a dynamic agency or effect not caused by an arbitrary act of will. On the contrary, it seizes and controls the human subject, who is always rather its victim than its creator. The numinosum, whatever its cause may be, is an experience of the subject independent of his will. At all events, religious teachings as well as consensus gentium always and everywhere explain this experience as being due to a cause external to the individual. The numinosum is either a quality belonging to a visible object or the influence of an invisible presence that causes a peculiar alteration of the consciousness. That is, at any rate, the general rule. Let's see here, hide the sidebar. There are, however, certain exceptions when it comes to the question of religious practice or ritual. A great many ritualistic performances are carried out for the sole purpose of producing at will the effect of numinosum by means of certain devices of a magical nature, such as invocation, incantation, sacrifice, meditation, and other yoga practices, self-inflicted tortures of various descriptions, and so forth. But a religious belief in an external and an objective divine cause is always prior to any such performance. The Catholic Church, for instance, administers the sacraments for the purposes of bestowing their spiritual blessings upon the believer. But since this act would amount to enforcing the presence of a divine grace by indubitably magical procedure, it is logically argued that nobody can compel divine grace to be present in the sacramental act. But that is nevertheless inevitably present, since the sacrament is a divine institution which God would not have caused to be if he had not intended to lend his support. Religion appears to me to be a peculiar attitude of mind which could be formulated in accordance with the original use of the word religio, which means a careful consideration and observation of certain dynamic factors that are conceived as powers, quote unquote, spirits, daemons, gods, laws, ideas, ideals, or whatever name man has given to such factors in this world. In his world, has he found powerful, dangerous, or helpful enough to be taken into careful consideration, or grand, beautiful, and meaningful enough to be devoutly worshipped and loved? In colloquial speech, one often says of somebody who is enthusiastically interested in certain pursuits that he is almost, quote, religiously devoted, unquote, to his cause. William James, for instance, remarked that a scientist often has no creed, but his, quote unquote, temper is devout. I want to make clear that by the term religion, I do not mean a creed. It is, however, true that every creed is originally based on the one hand upon the experience of the numinosum, and on the other hand upon gnosis, which is, I think, what that says in Greek. That is to say, trust or loyalty, maybe not gnosis, I don't know. Trust or loyalty, faith and confidence, and in a certain experience of a numinous nature and in the change of consciousness that ensues. The conversion of Paul is a striking example of this. We might say then that the term religion designates the attitude peculiar to a consciousness which has been changed by experience of the numinosum. I'm probably going to skip most of these footnotes. Creeds are codified and dogmatized forms of original religious experience. The contents of the experience have become sanctified and are usually congealed in a rigid, often elaborate structure of ideas. The practice and repetition of the original experience have become a ritual and unchangeable institution. This does not necessarily mean lifeless petrification. On the contrary, it may prove to be a valid form of religious experience for millions of people for thousands of years, without there arising any vital necessity to alter it. Although the Catholic Church has often been accused of particular rigidity, she nevertheless admits that dogma is a living thing and that its formulation is therefore capable of change and development. Even the number of dogmas is not limited to, or not limited and can be multiplied in the course of time. The same holds true of the ritual, yet all changes and developments are determined with the framework of facts as originally experienced, and this sets up a special kind of dogmatic content and emotional value. Even Protestantism, which has abandoned itself apparently to an almost unlimited emancipation from dogmatic tradition and codified ritual, and has thus split into more than 400 denominations. Even Protestantism is bound at least to be Christian and to express itself within the framework of the belief that God revealed himself in Christ who suffered for mankind. And I mean, he says 400 denomination. At least in the United States now, it's over 30,000 denominations. And they all think they're the true church, by the way. Pardon me. This is a definite framework with definite contents which cannot be combined with or supplemented by Buddhist or Islamic ideas and feelings. Yet it is unquestionably true that not only Buddha and Mohammed, Confucius and Zarathustra represent religious phenomena, but also Mithras, Attis, Sybil, Mani, Hermes, and deities of many other exotic cults. The psychologist, if he takes up a scientific attitude, has to disregard the claim of every creed to be the unique and eternal truth. He must keep his eye on the human side of the religious problem, since he is concerned with the original religious experience quite apart from what the creeds have made of it. As I am a doctor and a specialist in nervous and mental diseases, my point of departure is not a creed, but the psychology of the homo religiosus, the man who takes into account and carefully observes certain factors which influence him and, through him, his general condition. It is easy to denominate and to define these factors in accordance with historical tradition or ethnological knowledge, but to do the same thing from the standpoint of psychology is an uncommonly difficult task. What I can contribute to the question of religion is derived entirely from my practical experience, both with my patients and with so-called normal persons. As our experience with people depends to a large extent upon what we do with them, I can see no other way of proceeding than to give you at least a general idea of the line I take in my professional work. Since every neurosis is connected with a man's most intimate life, there is always to be some hesitation when a patient has to give a complete account of all the circumstances and complications which originally led him into a morbid condition. But why shouldn't he be able to talk freely? Why should he be afraid or shy or prudish? The reason is that he, quote, carefully observing, unquote, certain external factors which together constitute what one calls public opinion or respectability or reputation. Ain't that the truth? And even if he trusts his doctor and is no longer shy of him, he will be reluctant or even afraid to admit certain things to himself, as it were dangerous to become conscious of himself. One is usually afraid of things that seem to be overpowering, but is there anything in man that is stronger than himself? We should not forget that every neurosis entails a corresponding amount of demoralization. If a man is neurotic, he has lost the confidence in himself. A neurosis is a humiliating defeat, and it is felt as such by people who are not entirely conscious of their own psychology, which I would say is a large mass of people. And one is defeated by something quote-unquote unreal. Doctors may have assured the patient long ago that there is nothing the matter with him, that he does not suffer from a real heart disease or from a real cancer. His symptoms are quite imaginary. The more he believes that he is a malade imaginaire, the more a feeling of inferiority permeates his whole personality. If my symptoms are imaginary, he will say, where have I picked up this confounded imagination, and why should I put up with such a perfect nuisance? It is indeed pathetic to have an intelligent man almost imploringly assure you that he is suffering from an intestinal cancer and declare at the same time in a despondent voice that of course he knows his cancer is purely imaginary affair. Our usual materialistic conception of the psyche is, I am afraid, not particularly helpful in cases of neurosis. If only the soul were endowed with a subtle body, then one could at least say that this breath or vapor body was suffering from a real though somewhat ethereal cancer, in the same way as the gross material body can succumb to a cancerous disease. That at least would be something real. Medicine, therefore, feels a strong aversion for anything of a psyche nature. Either the body is ill or there is nothing the matter, and if you cannot prove that the body is really ill, then that is only because our present techniques do not enable the doctor to discover the true nature of the undoubtedly organic trouble. But what actually is the psyche? Materialistic prejudice explains it as a mere epiphenomenal byproduct of organic processes in the brain. Of course it does. Any psychic disturbance must therefore be an organic or psychical disorder which is undiscoverable only because the inadequacy of our present methods of diagnosis. The undeniable connection between psyche and brain gives this point of view a certain weight, but not enough to make it an unshakable truth. We do not know whether there is a real disturbance of the organic processes in the brain in a case of neurosis, and if there are disorders of an endocrine nature, it is impossible to say whether they might not be effects rather than causes. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the real causes of neurosis are psychological. Not so long ago, it was very difficult to imagine how an organic or physical disorder could be relieved by quite simple psychological means, yet in recent years, medical science has recognized the whole class of diseases, the psychosomatic disorders, in which the patient's psychology plays the essential part. Since my readers may not be familiar with these medical facts, I may instance a case of hysterical fever with a temperature of 102, which was cured in a few minutes through a confession of the psychological cause. A patient with psoriasis extending over practically the whole body was told I did not feel competent to treat his skin trouble, but that I should concentrate on his psychological conflicts, which were numerous. After 6 weeks of intense analysis and discussion of his purely psychological difficulties, there came about an unexpected byproduct, the almost complete disappearance of the skin disease. In another case, the patient had recently undergone an operation for his distension of the colon. 40 centimeters of it had been removed, but this was followed by another extraordinary distension. The patient was desperate and refused to permit a second operation, though the surgeon thought it vital. As soon as a certain intimate psychological facts were discovered, the colon began to function normally again. Such experiences make it exceedingly difficult to believe that the psyche is nothing or that an imaginary fact is unreal. It is not there where a nearsighted mind seeks it. It exists, but not in physical form. It is an almost absurd prejudice to suppose that existence can only be physical. As a matter of fact, the only form of existence of which we have immediate knowledge is psychic. We might as well say, on the contrary, that physical existence is a mere inference, since we know of matter only insofar as we perceive psychic images mediated by the senses. Oh, Mr. Jung. We are surely making a great mistake when we forget this simply yet fundamental truth. Indeed. Even if a neurosis has no cause at all other than imagination, it would nonetheless be a very real thing. If a man imagined that I was his arch enemy and killed me, I should be dead on account of mere imagination. Imaginary conditions do exist, and they may be just as real and just as harmful or dangerous as physical conditions. I believe that psychic disturbances are far more dangerous than epidemics or earthquakes. I would agree with you. Not even the medieval epidemics of the bubonic plague or smallpox killed as many people as certain differences of opinion in 1914 or certain political ideals in Russia. Wow. Oh, man. I mean, I can't argue with that. Although the mind cannot comprehend its own form of existence owing to the lack of Archimedean point outside, it nevertheless exists. Not only does the psyche exist, it is existence itself. What then shall we say to our patient with the imaginary cancer? I would tell them, quote, yes, my friend, you are really suffering from a cancer-like thing. You really do harbor in yourself a deadly evil. However, it will not kill your body because it is imaginary, but it will eventually kill your soul. It has already spoiled and even poisoned your human relations and your personal happiness and will go on growing until it has swallowed your whole psychic existence. So that in the end, you will not be a human being anymore, but an evil, destructive tumor, unquote. It is obvious that our patient It's obvious that to our patient, that he is not the author of his morbid imagination, although his theoretical turn of mind will certainly suggest that he is the owner and maker of his own imaginings. If a man is suffering from a real cancer, he never believes himself to be responsible for such an evil, despite the fact that the cancer is in his own body. But when it comes to the psyche, we instantly feel a kind of responsibility, as if we were the makers of our psychic conditions. This prejudice is of relatively recent date. Not so very long ago, even highly civilized people believed that psychic agencies could influence our minds and feelings. There were ghosts, wizards, witches, demons, angels, and even gods who could produce certain psychological changes in human beings. In former times, the man with the idea that he had cancer might have felt quite differently about this idea. He would have probably have assumed that somebody had worked witchcraft against him or that he was possessed. He never would have thought of himself as the originator of such a fantasy. As a matter of fact, I take this cancer to be a spontaneous growth which originated in the part of the psyche that is not identical with consciousness. It appears as an autonomous formation intruding upon consciousness. Of consciousness, one might say that it is our own psychic existence, but the cancer has its own psychic existence, independent of ourselves. This statement seems to formulate the observable facts completely. If we submit such a case to an association experiment, we soon discover that man is not master in his own house. His reactions will be delayed, altered, suppressed, or replaced by autonomous intruders. There will be a number of stimulus words which cannot be answered by his conscious intention. They will be answered by certain autonomous contents which are very often unconscious even to himself. In our case, we shall certainly discover answers that come from the psychic complex at the root of the cancer idea. Whenever a stimulus word touches something connected with the hidden complex, the reaction of the conscious ego will be disturbed or even replaced by an answer coming from the complex. Excuse me. It is just as if the complex were autonomous being capable of interfering with the intentions of the ego. Pardon me. Complexes do behave like secondary or partial personalities possessing a mental life of their own. Many complexes are split off from consciousness because the latter preferred to get rid of them by repression. But there are others that have never in consciousness before and therefore that yeah. Pardon me. Got a frog in my throat. See if I can get rid of it here. So, going back to the beginning here, many complexes are split off from consciousness because the latter preferred to get rid of them by repression. But there are others that have never been in consciousness before and therefore could never have been arbitrarily repressed. They grow of the unconscious and invade the conscious mind with their weird and unassailable convictions and impulses. Uh-oh. I'm not sure I'll be able to get through this. Excuse me. All right. I'm going to go quickly take some cough syrup. I'll be right back. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Still getting over that cold. Okay, so they grow, let's see here. They grow out of the unconscious and invade the conscious mind with their weird and unstable convictions and impulses. Yeah, got that one. Making sure the sound is good here. Yep, all right, good. Our patient belongs to the latter category. Despite his culture and intelligence, he was a helpless victim of something that obsessed and possessed him. He was unable to help himself in any way against the demonic power of his morbid idea. It proliferated in him like a carcinoma. One day the idea appeared, and from then on it remained unshakable. There were only short intervals when he was free from it. The existence of such cases does something to explain why people are afraid of becoming conscious of themselves. There might really be something behind the screen one never knows, and so people refer to, quote, to consider and observe carefully, unquote, the factors external to their consciousness. Goodness. Excuse me. In most people, there is a sort of primitive, some Greek word, with regard to the possible contents of the unconscious. Beneath all natural shyness and blame and tact, there is a secret fear of the unknown, perils of the soul. Goodness gracious, sorry. Of course, one is reluctant to admit such a ridiculous fear, but one should realize that this fear is by no means unjustified. On the contrary, it is only too well founded. We can never be sure that a new idea will not seize upon ourselves or upon our neighbors. We know from modern as well as from ancient history that such ideas are often so strange, indeed so bizarre, that they fly in the face of reason. The fascination, which is almost invariably connected with ideas of this sort, produces a fanatical obsession, with the result that all dissenters, no matter how well-meaning or reasonable they are, get burnt alive or have their heads cut off or are disposed of in masses by the more modern machine gun. Man, I can't get rid of this cough. I'm gonna have to take some raw honey or something. Excuse me. We cannot even console ourselves with the thought of such things belong to the remote past. Unfortunately, they seem to belong not only to the present, but quite particularly to the future. Yeah, that's true. Homo homini lupus is a sad yet eternal truism. I'm not sure what that means. There is indeed reason enough for man to be afraid of the impersonal forces lurking in his consciousness. We are blissfully unconscious of these forces because they never, or almost never, appear in our personal relations or under ordinary circumstances. But if people crowd together and form a mob, then the dynamisms of the collective man are let loose, beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he is part of a mob. Man in the mass sinks unconsciously to an inferior moral and intellectual levels, to that level which is always there below the threshold of consciousness, ready to break forth as soon as it is activated by the formation of a mass. It is, to my mind, a fatal mistake to regard the human psyche as a purely personal affair and to explain it exclusively from a personal point of view. Such a mode of explanation is only applicable to the individual in his ordinary everyday occupation and relationships. If, however, some slight trouble occurs, perhaps in the form of an unforeseen and somewhat unusual event, instantly instinctual forces are called up, forces which appear to be wholly unexpected, new, and strange. They can no longer be explained in terms of personal motives, being comparable rather to certain primitive occurrences like panics or solar eclipses and the like. To explain the murderous outbreak of Bolshevism, for instance, as a personal father complex appears to me singularly inadequate. The change of character brought about by the uprush of collective forces is amazing. A gentle and reasonable being can be transformed into a maniac or a savage beast. One is always inclined to lay the blame on external circumstances, but nothing could explode in us if it had not already been there. Exactly. As a matter of fact, we are constantly living on the edge of a volcano, and there is, as so far as we know, no way of protecting ourselves from a possible outburst that will destroy everybody within reach. It is certainly a good thing to preach reason and common sense, but what if you have a lunatic's asylum for an audience or a crowd in a collective frenzy? There is not much difference between them because the madman and the mob are both moving by impersonal, overwhelming forces. And, I will just comment here that if you think about what he's saying here in a larger context of countries and how these people at the top just constantly irritate the shit out of all of us, excuse my language there, but irritate the hell out of all of us, you know, in ways that keep us crazy, and then people do act like mobs. And yeah, I mean, just look around. I think he makes a very good point on the collective side of things. Continuing, as a matter of fact, it only needs a neurosis to conjure up a force that cannot be dealt with by rational means. Our cancer case shows clearly how impotent man's reason and intellect are against the most palpable nonsense. I have always advised my patients to take such obvious but invincible nonsense as the manifestation of a power and a meaning they have not yet understood. Experience has taught me that it is much more effective to take these things seriously and then look for a suitable explanation. But an explanation is suitable only when it produces a hypothesis equal to the morbid effect. Our patient is confronted with a power of will and suggestion more than equal to anything his consciousness can put against it. In this precarious situation, it would be a bad strategy to convince him that in some incomprehensible way he is at the back of his own symptom, secretly inventing and supporting it. Such a suggestion would instantly paralyze his frightened spirit and he would get demoralized. It is far better for him to understand that his complex is an autonomous power directed against his conscious personality. Moreover, such an explanation fits the actual facts much better than a reduction of personal motives. And apparently, personal motivation does exist, but it is not made by his will, it just happens to him. When in the Babylonian epic Gilgamesh's arrogance and hubris defy the gods, they create a man equal in strength to Gilgamesh in order to check the hero's unlawful ambition. The very same thing has happened in our patient. He is a thinker who has settled, or is always going to settle, the world by the power of his intellect and reason. His ambition, at least, succeeded in forging his own personal fate. He has forced everything under the inexorable law of his reason, but somewhere nature escaped and came back with vengeance in the form of an unassailable bit of nonsense, the cancer idea. This was the clever device of the unconscious to keep him on a merciless and cruel leash. It was the worst blow that could be dealt to all his rational ideas, and especially to his belief in the all-powerful human will. Such an obsession can only occur in a person who makes habitual misuse of reason and intellect for egotistical power purposes. Gilgamesh, however, escaped the vengeance of the god. He had warning dreams to which he paid attention. They showed him how he could overcome his enemy. Our patient, living in an age when the gods have become extinct, have fallen into bad repute, so also had such dreams, but he did not listen to them. How could an intelligent man be so superstitious as to take dreams seriously? The very common prejudice against dream is but one symptom of a far more serious undervaluation of the human psyche in general. The marvelous development of science and techniques is counterbalanced by an appalling lack of wisdom and introspection. I agree with that. Excuse me. Goodness. It is true that our religion speaks of an immortal soul, but it has very few kind words to say for the human psyche as such, which would go straight to an eternal damnation were it not for a special act of divine grace. These two important factors are largely responsible for the general undervaluation of the psyche, but not entirely so. Older by far than these relatively recent developments are the primitive fear and of aversion to everything that borders on unconscious. Consciousness must have been a very precarious thing in its beginnings. In relatively primitive societies, we can still observe how easily consciousness gets lost. One of the, quote, perils of the soul, unquote, for instance, is the loss of a soul. This is what happens when part of the psyche becomes unconscious again. Another example is, quote, running amok, unquote, the equivalent of, quote, going berserk, unquote, in Germanic saga. Okay, yeah, going berserk in Germanic saga. This is a more or less complete trance state, often accompanied by devastating social effects. Even a quite ordinary emotion can cause considerable loss of consciousness. Primitives, therefore, cultivate elaborate forms of politeness, speaking in hushed voices, laying down their weapons, crawling on all fours, bowing the head, showing the palms. Even our own forms of politeness still exhibit a, quote, religious unquote, consideration of possible psychic dangers. We propitiate, we propitiate fate by magically wishing one another a good day. It is not good. It is not good form to keep It is not good form to keep the left hand in your pocket or behind your back when shaking hands. If you want to be particularly ingratiating, you use both hands. Before people of great authority, we bow with uncovered head, i.e., we offer our head unprotected in order to propitiate the powerful one, who might quite easily fall sudden prey to a fit of uncontrollable violence. In war dances, primitives can become so excited that they may even shed blood. The life of the primitive is filled with constant regard for the ever-lurking possibility of psychic danger, and the procedures employed to diminish the risks are very numerous. The setting up of a tabooed area is an outward expression of this fact. The innumerable taboos are delimited psychic areas which are meticulously and fearfully observed. I once made a terrific mistake when I was with a tribe on the southern slopes of Mount Elgon in East Africa. I wanted to inquire about the ghost houses I frequently found in the woods, and during a palaver I mentioned the words seletini, seleltini, meaning ghost. Instantly, everybody was silent and painfully embarrassed. They all looked away from me because I had spoken aloud a carefully hushed-up word and had thus invited most dangerous consequences. I had to change the subject in order to be able to continue the meeting, and the same men assured me that they never had dreams. They were the prerogative of the chief and of the medicine man. The medicine man then confessed to me that he no longer had dreams either. They had the district commissioner instead. Quote, "Since the English are in the country, we have no dreams anymore," unquote. He said, end quote, "The district commissioner knows everything about war and diseases and about where we have got to live," unquote. That's weird. This strange statement is based on the fact that dreams were formerly the supreme political guide, the voice of the Mungu god. Therefore, it would have been unwise for an ordinary man to suggest that he had dreams. Dreams are the voice of the unknown, ever threatening new schemes, new dangers, sacrifices, warfare, and other troublesome things. An African black once dreamt that his enemies had taken him prisoner and burnt him alive. The next day he called his relatives together and implored them to burn him. They consented so far as to bind his feet together and put them in the fire. He was of course badly crippled, but he had escaped his foes. There are any amount of magical rites that exist for the sole purpose of erecting a defense against the unexpected, dangerous tendencies of the unconscious. The particular fact that the dream is a divine voice in the messenger and yet an unending source of trouble does not disturb the primitive mind in the least. We find obvious remnants of this primitive thinking in the psychology of the Hebrew prophets. Often enough they hesitate to listen to the voice, and it was, we must admit, rather hard on a pious man like Hosea to marry a harlot in order to obey the Lord's command. Since the dawn of humanity, there has been a marked tendency to limit this unruly and arbitrary, quote-unquote, supernatural influence by means of definite forms and laws, and this process has continued throughout history in the form of multiplication of rites, institutions, and beliefs. During the last 2,000 years, we find the institution of the Christian Church taking over a mediation and protective function between these influences and man. It is not denied in medieval ecclesiastical writings that a divine influx may occur in dreams, but this view is not exactly encouraged, and the Church reserves the right to decide whether a revelation is to be considered authentic or not. Wow, look at this footnote is huge. Does it end there? No, it doesn't. Holy smokes. Okay. Again, I'm not going to read these footnotes. If you guys, I'm going to put the link to this in the description box. So if you guys want to read, go into the footnotes because there's some interesting stuff in here. Here, this is this footnotes in his excellence treatise on dreams and their functions, Benedictus Pererius, and it goes on to talk about what he's talking about. So, in spite of the Church's recognition that certain dreams are sent by God, she is disinclined and even averse to any serious concerns with dreams, while admitting that some might conceivably contain an immediate revelation. Thus, the change of mental attitude that has taken place in recent centuries is, from this point of view at least, not wholly unwelcome to the Church, because it has effectively discouraged It effectively discouraged the earlier introspective attitude which favored a serious consideration of dreams and inner experiences. Protestantism, having pulled down so many walls carefully erected by the Church, immediately began to experience a disintegration and schismatic effect of individual revelation. As soon as the dogmatic fence was broken down and the ritual lost its authority, man had to face his inner experience without the protection and guidance of dogma and ritual, which are the very quintessence of Christian as well as of pagan religious experience. I would agree with that 100%. Protestantism has, in the main, lost all the finer shades of traditional Christianity: the Mass, confession, the greater part of the liturgy, and the vicarious function of the priesthood. I must emphasize that this statement is not a value judgment and is not intended to be one. I merely state the facts. Protestantism has, however, intensified the authority of the Bible as a substitute for the lost authority of the Church. But as history has shown, one can interpret certain biblical texts in many ways. Nor has scientific criticism of the New Testament been very helpful in enhancing belief in the divine character of the Holy Scriptures. It is also a fact that under the influence of the so-called scientific enlightenment, great masses of educated people have either left the Church or become profoundly indifferent to it. If we were all dull rationalists or neurotic intellectuals, the loss would not be regrettable, but many of them are religious people, only incapable of agreeing with the existing forms of belief. Otherwise, one could hardly explain the remarkable effect of the Buckman movement or of the more or less educated Protestant classes. The Catholic who has turned his back on the Church usually develops a secret or manifest leaning towards atheism, whereas the Protestant follows, if possible, a sectarian movement. The absolutism of the Catholic Church seems to demand an equally absolute negation, whereas Protestant relativism permits of variations. It may perhaps be thought that I have gone a bit too far into the history of Christianity, and for no other purpose than to explain their prejudice against dreams and inner experiences. But what I have just said might have been part of my conversation with our cancer patient. I told him that it would be better to take his obsession seriously instead of reviling it as a pathological nonsense. But to take it seriously would mean acknowledging it as a sort of diagnostic statement of fact that in a psyche which really existed, trouble had arisen in the form of a cancer-like growth. But, he will certainly ask, what could that growth be? And I shall answer, I do not know, and as indeed I do not. Although, as I mentioned before, it is surely a compensatory or complementary unconscious formation. Nothing is yet known about its specific nature or about its content. It is a spontaneous manifestation of the unconscious, based on contents which are not to be found in consciousness. My patient is now very curious how I shall set about getting at the contents that form the root of the obsession. I then inform him of the risk of shocking him severely, that his dreams will provide us with all the necessary information. We will take them as if they issued from an intelligent, purposive, and as it were, personal source. This, of course, is a bold hypothesis and at the same time an adventure, because we are going to give extraordinary credit to a discredited entity, the psyche, whose very existence is still denied by not a few contemporary psychologists as well as by philosophers. A famous anthropologist, when I showed him my way of proceeding, made the typical remark, quote, "That's all very interesting indeed, but dangerous." Yes, I admit it is dangerous, but as dangerous as a neurosis. If you want to cure a neurosis, so unquote by this thing, that's all very interesting indeed, but dangerous, unquote. So yes, I admit it is dangerous, but just as dangerous as a neurosis. If you want to cure a neurosis, you have to risk something. To do something without taking a risk is merely ineffectual, as we know only too well. A surgical operation for cancer is a risk too, and yet it has to be done. For the sake of better understanding, I have often felt tempted to advise my patients to think of the psyche as a subtle body in which subtle tumors can grow. The prejudiced belief that the psyche is an unimaginable and consequently less than air, or that it is more or less intellectual system of logical concepts, is so great that when people are not conscious of certain contents, they assume that they do not exist. They have no confidence and no belief in a reliable psyche functioning outside consciousness, and dreams are thought to be only ridiculous. Under such conditions, my proposal arouses the worst suspicions. And indeed, I have heard every argument under the sun used against the vague specters of dreams. Yet in dreams, we find without any profound analysis, Without any profound analysis, the same conflicts and complexes whose existence can also be demonstrated by the association test. Moreover, these complexes form an integral part of the existing neurosis. We have therefore reason to believe that the dreams can give us at least we have, therefore, reason to believe that dreams can give us at least as much information as the association test can about the content of neurosis. As a matter of fact, they give us very much more. The symptom is like the shoot above the ground. Yet the main plant is an extended rhizome underground. The rhizome represents the content of a neurosis. It is the matrix of complexes, of symptoms, and of dreams. That's a good allegory. We have every reason to believe that dreams mirror exact the underground process of the psyche, and if we get there, we literally get the quote-unquote roots of the disease. As it is not my intention to go any further into the psychopathology of neurosis, I propose to choose another case as an example of how dreams reveal the unknown inner facts of psyche and what these facts consist. The dreamer was another intellectual of remarkable intelligence and learning. He was neurotic and was seeking my help because he felt that his neurosis had become overpowering and was slowly but surely undermining his morale. Unfortunately, his intellectual integrity had not yet suffered, and he had the free use of his fine intelligence. For this reason, I set him the task of observing and recording his dreams himself. The dreams were not analyzed or explained to him, and it was only very much later that we began their analysis. Thus, the dreams I am going to relate have not been tampered with at all. They represent an entirely uninfluenced nature of sequence events. The patient had never read any psychology, much less any analytical psychology. Since the series consists of over 400 dreams, I could not possibly convey an impression of the whole material, but I have published elsewhere a selection of 74 dreams containing the motifs of special religious interests. The dreamer, it should be said, was a Catholic by education, but no longer a practicing one, nor was he interested in religious problems. He was one of those scientifically minded intellectuals who would be simply amazed if anyone should saddle them with religious views of any kind. If one holds that the unconscious has a psychic existence independent of consciousness, a case such as that of our dreamer might be of a particular interest, provided we are not mistaken in our conception of the religious character of certain dreams. And if one lays stress on the conscious mind alone and does not credit the unconscious with an independent existence, it will be interesting to find out whether or not the dreams really derive their material from conscious contents. Should the facts favor the hypothesis of the unconscious, one could then use dreams as possible sources of information about the religious tendencies of the unconscious. One could not expect dreams to speak of religions as we know it. There are, however, 2 dreams among the 400 that obviously deal with religion. I will now give the text which the dreamer himself had taken down. So here we go, the dream in italics. Quote on the dream: all the houses have something theatrical about them, with stage scenery and decorations. The name of Bernard Shaw is mentioned. The play is supposed to take place in a distant future. There is a notice in English and German on one of the sets. And this is the Universal Catholic Church. It is the Church of the Lord. All those who feel that they are the instruments of the Lord may enter. Under this is printed in smaller letters, quote, the church was founded by Jesus and Paul, unquote, like a firm advertising its long standing. I say to my friend, quote, come on, let's have a look at this, unquote. He replies, quote, I do not see why a lot of people have to get together when they're feeling religious, unquote. I answer, quote, as a Protestant, you will never understand, unquote. A woman nods empathetic approval. Then I see a sort of proclamation on the wall of the church. It runs, soldiers, when you feel you are under the power of the Lord, do not address him directly. The Lord cannot be reached by words. We also strongly advise you not to indulge in any discussions among yourselves concerning the attributes of the Lord. It is futile, for everything valuable and important is ineffable. Signed, Pope, name ineligible. Now we go in. The interior resembles a mosque, more particularly the Hagia Sophia. No seats, wonderful effect of space, no images, only framed text of decorated the walls like the Quran text in the Hagia Sophia. One of the texts reads, quote, "Do not flatter your benefactor," unquote. The woman who had nodded approval burst into tears and cries, quote, "Then there's nothing left," unquote. And I reply, quote, "I find it quite right," unquote. But she vanishes, and at first I stand with a pillar in front of me and can see nothing. Then I change my position and see a crowd of people. I do not belong to them and stand alone, but they are quite clear so that I can see their faces. They all say in unison, quote, "We confess that we are under the power of the Lord. The kingdom of heaven is within us," unquote. They repeat this 3 times with great solemnity. Then the organ starts to play, and they sing a Bach fugue with chorale. With a choral. But the original text is omitted. Sometimes there is only a sort of coloratura singing, and then the words are repeated, quote, everything else is paper," unquote, meaning that it does not make a living impression on me. When the choral has faded away, the Gemmeltisch part of the ceremony begins. It is almost like a student's party. The people are all cheerful and equable, and we move about, converse, and greet one another, and wine from an Episcopal seminary is served with other from an Episcopal seminary is served with other refreshments. The health of the church is drunk, and as if to express everybody's pleasure at the increase in membership, a loudspeaker blares a ragtime melody with a refrain, quote, "Charles is also with us now," unquote. A priest explains to me, quote, "These somewhat trivial amusements are officially approved and permitted. We must adapt a little to American methods. With a large crowd such as we have here, this is inevitable. But we differ in principle from the American churches by our decidedly anti-ascetic tendencies," unquote. Thereupon I awake with a feeling of great relief. And that is the end of the dream. So, continuing with the lecture. There are, as you know, numerous works on the phenomenology of dreams, but very few that deal with their psychology. This for the obvious reason that a psychological interpretation of dreams is an exceedingly ticklish and risky business. Freud has made a courageous attempt to elucidate the intricacies of dream psychology with the help of views which he gathered in the field of psychopathology. Much as I admire the boldness of his attempt, I cannot agree either with his method or with his results. He explains a dream as a mere facade behind which something has carefully hidden. There is no doubt that neurotics hide disagreeable things, probably just as much as normal people do, but it is a serious question whether this category can be applied to such a normal and worldwide phenomenon as the dream. I doubt whether we can assume that a dream is something more than it appears to be. I am rather inclined to quote another Jewish authority, the Talmud, which says, quote, "The dream is its own interpretation," unquote. In other words, I take the dream for what it is. The dream is such a difficult and complicated thing that I do not dare to make assumptions about its possible cunning or its tendency to deceive. The dream is a natural occurrence, and there is no earthly reason why we should assume that it is a crafty device to lead us astray. It occurs when consciousness and will are to a large extent extinguished. It seems to be a natural product, which is also found in people who are not neurotic. Moreover, we know so little about psychology of the dream process that we must be more than careful when we introduce it into its explanation elements that are foreign to the dream itself. For all these reasons, I hold that our dream really is speaking of religion and that it intends to do so. Since the dream has a coherent and well-designed structure, it suggests a certain logic and a certain intention. That is, it has meaningful motivation which finds direct expression in the dream content. The first part of the dream is a serious attempt in favor of the Catholic Church. A certain Protestant point of view that religion is just as an individual experience is discouraged by the dreamer. The second, more grotesque part is the Church's adaptation to the decidedly worldly standpoint, and the end is a statement in favor of an anti-ascetic tendency, which would not and could not be backed up by the real Church. Nevertheless, the dreamer's anti-ascetic priest makes it a matter of principle. Spiritualization and sublimation are essentially Christian principles, and any instance upon the contrary would amount to a blasphemous paganism. Christianity has never been worldly, nor has it ever looked with favor on good food and wine, and it is more than doubtful whether the introduction of jazz into the cult would be a particular asset. The cheerful and equable people who this word's got me. Peripatetically? I'm not even sure. Okay, converse with each other in more or less Epicurean style, remind one more of an ancient philosophical ideal, which is rather distasteful to the contemporary Christian. In the first and second part of the importance of masses or crowds of people is emphasized. Thus, the Catholic Church, though highly recommended, appears coupled with a strange pagan point of view, which is irreconcilable with a fundamentally Christian attitude. The actual irreconcilability does not appear in the dream. It is hushed up, as it were, by a cozy Gemmeltuch atmosphere in which the dangerous contrasts are blurred and blended. The Protestant conception of an individual relationship to God is swamped by mass organization and correspondingly collective religious feelings. The insistence on crowds and the insinuation of the pagan ideal are remarkable parallels to things that are actually happening in Europe today. Everybody has astonished at the pagan tendencies to modern Germany because nobody knew how to interpret Nietzsche's Dionysian experience. Nietzsche was but one of the thousands and millions of Germans yet unborn in whose unconscious the Teutonic cousins of Dionysus, Wotan, came to birth during the Great War, and the dreams of the Germans whom I treated when I could clearly see the Watanistic revolution coming on, and in 1918 I published an article in which I pointed out the particular kind of new development to be expected in Germany. Interesting. Those Germans were by no means people who had studied Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and certainly the young people who resurrected the pagan sacrifices of sheep knew nothing of Nietzsche's experience. That is why they called their god Wotan and not Dionysus. In Nietzsche's biography, you will find irrefutable proof that the god he originally meant was really Wotan, but being a philologist and living in the 70s and 80s of the 19th century, he called him Dionysus. Looked at from a comparative point of view, the two gods have much in common. There is apparently no opposition to collective feelings, mass religion, and paganism anywhere in the dream of my patient, except for the Protestant friend who was soon reduced to silence. One curious incident merits our attention, and that is the unknown woman who first backs up the eulogy of the Catholicism and then suddenly bursts into tears saying there is nothing left and vanishes without returning. Who is this woman? To the dreamer, she is a vague and unknown person. But when he had that dream, he was already well acquainted with her as the quote unknown woman unquote, who had frequently appeared in previous dreams. As this figure plays a great role in men's dreams, it bears the technical name of the anima, which reference to the fact that from time immemorial, man in his myths has expressed the idea of a male and female coexisting in the same body. Haven't we seen those motifs over and over again in our studies, guys? Pardon me. Such psychological institutions were usually projected in the form of divine syzygy, the divine pair, or in the idea of the hermaphroditic nature of the creator. Edward Maitland, the biographer of Anna Kingsford, relates in our own day an inner experience of the bisexual nature of the deity. Then there is Hermetic philosophy, with its hermaphroditic and its androgynous inner man, the Homo Adamicus, who, quote, although he appears in masculine form, always carries about him Eve or his wife hidden in his body, unquote. Yeah, look at that. It's an interesting duality right there in the early part of the Old Testament. As a medieval commentator on Hermetis Tractatus Aurelius says, the anima is presumably a psychic representation of the minority of female genes in a man's body. This is all the more problematic since the same figure is not to be found in the imagery of a woman's unconscious. There is a corresponding figure, however, that plays an equivalent role, yet it is not a woman's image but a man's. This masculine figure in a woman's psychology has been termed the animus. One of the most typical manifestations of both figures is what has been long called the quote-unquote animosity. The anima causes illogical moods, and the animus produces irritating platitudes and unreasonable opinions. Both are frequent dream figures. As a rule, they personify the unconscious and give it a particularly disagreeable or irritating character. The unconscious in itself has no such negative qualities. They appear only when it is personified by these figures and when they begin to influence consciousness, being partial personalities. They have the character either of an inferior woman or an inferior man, hence their irritating effect. The man experiencing this influence will be subject to unaccountable moods, and a woman will be argumentative and produce opinions that are besides the mark. I think we can all I think we could all agree on those kinds of statements, right? I mean, that's just life. The negative reaction of the anima to the church dream indicates that the dreamer's feminine side is unconscious, disagrees with his conscious attitude. The disagreement started with the text on the wall, quote, "Do not flatter your benefactor," unquote, which the dreamer agreed with. The meaning of the text seems sound enough so that one does not understand why the woman should feel so desperate about it. Without delving further into this mystery, which we must content ourselves for the time being with the statement that there is a contradiction in the dream, that a very important minority has left the stage under vivid protest and pays no more attention to the proceedings. We gather then from the dream that the unconscious function of the dreamer's mind has produced a pretty flat compromise between Catholicism and pagan joie de vivre, so joy of life. The product of the unconscious is manifestly not expressing a fixed point of view or definite opinion. Rather, it's a dramatic exposition of an act of reflection. It could be formulated perhaps as follows, quote, "Now, what about this religious business? You are a Catholic, are you not? Is that not good enough? But asceticism, well, even the church has to adapt a little. Movies, radio, spiritual 5 o'clock tea and all that. Why not some ecclesiastical wine and gay acquaintances," unquote. But for some secret reason, this awkward mystery woman, well known from many other former dreams, seems to be deeply disappointed and quits. I must confess that I find myself in sympathy with the anima. Obviously, the compromise is too cheap and too superficial, but it is characteristic of the dreamer as well as many other people to whom religion does not matter very much. Religion was of no concern to my patient, and he certainly never expected that it would concern him in any way. But he had come to me because of a very alarming experience. Being highly rationalistic and intellectual, he found that his attitude of mind and his philosophy forsook him completely in the face of his neurosis and its demoralizing forces. He found nothing in his whole Weltanschauung that would help him to gain sufficient control of himself. He was therefore very much in the situation of a man deserted by his hitherto cherished convictions and ideals. It is by no means extraordinary that under such conditions a man should return to the religion of his childhood in the hope of finding something helpful there. It was, however, not a conscious attempt or decision to revivify his earlier religious beliefs. He merely dreamt it. That is, his unconscious produced a peculiar statement about his religion. It is just as if the spirit and the flesh, the eternal enemies in Christian consciousness, had made peace with each other in the form of a curious mitigation of their contradictory nature. Spirituality and worldliness come together in an unexpected amity. The effect is slightly grotesque and comical. The inexorable severity of the spirit seems to be undermined by an almost antique gaiety perfumed with wine and roses. All events in dreams describes a spiritual and worldly atmosphere that dulls the sharpness of a moral conflict and swallows up in oblivion all mental pain and distress. If this was a wishful fulfillment, it was surely a conscious one, for it was precisely what the patient had already done into excess, and he was not unconscious of this either, since wine was one of his most dangerous enemies. The dream, on the other hand, is an impartial statement of the patient's spiritual condition. It gives a picture of degenerate religion corrupted by worldliness and mob instincts. There is a religious sentimentality instead of a numinosum of divine experience. This is the well-known characteristic of a religion that has lost its living mystery. It is readily understandable that such a religion is incapable of giving help or of having any other moral effect. The overall aspect of the dream is definitely unfavorable, although certain other aspects of a more positive nature are dimly visible. It rarely happens that the dreams are either exclusively positive or exclusively negative. As a rule, one finds both aspects, but usually one is stronger than the other. It is obvious that such a dream provides the psychologist with enough material to raise the problem of a religious attitude. If our dream were only the ones we possess, we could hardly hope to unlock its innermost meaning. but we have quite a number of dreams in our series which point to a remarkable religious problem. I never, if I can help it, interpret one dream by itself. As a rule, dream belongs in a series, since there is a continuity of consciousness despite the fact that it is regularly interrupted by sleep. There is probably also continuity of unconscious processes, perhaps even more than with the events of consciousness. In any case, my experience is in favor of the probability that dreams are the visible links in a chain of unconscious events. If we want to shed any light on the deeper reasons for the dream, we must go back to the series and find out where it is located in the long chain of 400 dreams. We find our dream wedged in between two important dreams of uncanny quality. The dream before reports that there is a gathering of many people and that a peculiar ceremony is taking place, apparently of magical character, for the purpose of, quote, reconstructing the gibbon, unquote. The dreamer, after, is concerned with a similar theme, the magical transformation of animals into beings. Both dreams are intensely disagreeable and very alarming to the patient, whereas the church dream manifestly moves on the surface and expresses opinions which in other circumstances could just as well have been thought consciously. These two dreams are strange and remote in character, and their emotional effect is such that the dreamer would avoid them if possible. As a matter of fact, the text of the second dream says, "If one runs away, all is lost." Quote, "If one runs away, all is lost," unquote. Curiously enough, this remark coincides with that of the unknown woman. Quote, "Then there is nothing left," unquote. The inference is to be drawn from these remarks is that the church dream was an attempt to escape from the other dream ideas of a much deeper significance. These ideas appear in the dreams occurring immediately before and after. Interesting. So, we're going to get into dogmas and natural symbols. I'm going to continue reading, but I do have to take a little break here. So, just give me about 5 minutes or so that I can use the restroom and fill up on a drink and all that. And I will be right back, guys. Okay, I'm back. Let's go ahead and share the screen. Oops, wrong button. Here we go. Okay. Dogma and natural symbols. The first of these dreams, the one preceding the church dream, speaks of a ceremony whereby an ape is to be reconstructed. To explain this point sufficiently would require too many details. I must therefore restrict myself to the mere statement that the quote unquote ape refers to the dreamer's instinctual personality, which he had completely neglected in favor of an exclusively intellectual attitude. The result had been that his instincts got the better of him and attacked him at times in the form of uncontrollable outbursts. The quote unquote reconstruction of the ape means the rebuilding of the instinctual personality within the framework of the hierarchy of consciousness. Such a reconstruction is only possible if accompanied by important changes in the conscious attitude. The patient was naturally afraid of the tendencies of the unconscious because hitherto they had revealed themselves to him in their most unfavorable form. The church dream that followed represents an attempt to seek refuge from this fear in the shelter of a church religion. The third dream, in speaking of the, quote, transformation of animals into beings, unquote, obviously continues the theme of the first one, that is, the ape is reconstructed solely for the purpose of being transformed later into a human being. In other words, the patient has to undergo an important change through the reintegration of his hitherto split off instinctuality and is thus to be made over in a new man. The modern mind has forgotten those old truths that speak of the death of the old man and the making of a new one, of spiritual rebirth and such like old-fashioned, quote, mystical absurdities, unquote. My patient, being a scientist of today, was more than once seized by panic when he realized how much he was gripped by such thoughts. He was afraid he was going mad, whereas the man of 2,000 years ago would have welcomed such dreams and rejoiced in hope of a magical rebirth and renewal of life. That speaks volumes about modern man. But our modern attitude looks back arrogantly upon the mists of superstition and of medieval or primitive credulity, entirely forgetting that we carry the whole living past in the lower stories of the skyscraper of rational consciousness. Without the lower stories of our mind is suspended in midair. No wonder it gets nervous. The true history of the mind is not preserved in learning volumes, but in living psychic organism of every individual. Good point. I must admit, however, that the idea of renewal took on shapes that could easily shock a modern mind. It is indeed difficult, if not impossible, to connect rebirth as we understand it with the way it is depicted in dreams. But before we discuss this strange and unexpected transformation there are hinted at, we should turn our attention to the other manifestly religious dream to which I alluded before. While the church dream comes relatively early in the long series, the following dream belongs to the latter stages of the process. This is the literal text. And here we are in italics, and so we're quoting the dream here. So, quote, I come to a strange solemn house, the, quote, house of the gathering, unquote. Many candles are burning in the background, arranged in a peculiar fashion with 4 points running upward. Outside at the door of the house, the old man is posted. People are going in, they say nothing and stand motionless in order to collect themselves inwardly. The man at the door says of the visitors to the house, quote, when they come out again, they are cleansed, unquote. I go in the house myself and find I can concentrate perfectly. Then a voice says, quote, what are you doing? What you are doing is dangerous. Religion is not a tax to be paid so that you can rid yourself of the woman's image, for this image cannot be got rid of. Woe unto them who use religion as a substitute for the other side of the soul's life. They are in error and will be accursed. Religion is no substitute. It is to be added to the other activities of the soul as the ultimate completion. Out of the fullness of life shall you bring forth your religion. Only then shall you be blessed. Unquote. While the last sentence is being spoken in ringing tones, I hear distant music, simple chords on an organ. Something about it reminds me of Wagner's fire music. As I leave the house, I see a burning mountain, and I feel, quote, the fire that is not put out is a holy fire, unquote. And then it says, Shaw, St. Joan. And that's the end of that quote, the quotation for the dream. So back to the text. The patient was deeply impressed by this dream. It was solemn, and powerful. It was a solemn and powerful experience for him, one of several which produced a far-reaching change in his attitude to life and humanity. Excuse me. It is not difficult to see this dream forms a parallel to the church dream, only this time the church has become a house of solemnity and self-collection. There is no indication of ceremonies or of any other known attributes of the Catholic Church, which, with the sole exception of the burning candles, which are arranged in a symbolic form probably derived from the Catholic cult. They form our four pyramids, or points, which perhaps anticipate the final vision of the flaming mountain. The appearance of the number 4 is, however, a regular feature in the patient's dreams and plays a very important role. The holy fire refers to Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, as a dreamer himself observes. The unquenchable fire, on the other hand, is a well-known attribute of the deity, not only in the Old Testament, but also as an allegoria Christi and an uncanonical logion cited in Origen's homilies. Good old Origen. Oh boy. And then there is this Latin here. Et ipsi salvator qui justa me est justa ignem est qui longa est mi longa est regno. The Savior himself says, whoever is near to me is near to the fire. Whoever is far from me is far from the kingdom. Ah, okay. Thank God he did that. Sometimes he throws Latin in here with nothing else. So yes, so in Origen's homily, is the Savior himself says, whoever is near me is near to the fire, whoever is far from me is far from the kingdom. Which, if you guys have checked out the Philosophy of Fire book, that definitely plays along those old themes. Since the time of Heraclitus, life has been conceived as a bunch of Greek words, an ever-living fire, and as Christ calls himself the life, the uncanonical saying is quite understandable. The fire signifying life fits into the frame of the dream, for it emphasizes that the fullness of life is the only legitimate source of religion. Thus, the 4 fiery points function almost as an icon denoting the presence of the deity or an equivalent being. In the system of the Barbello Gnosis, 4 lights surround the autogenes, the self-born or uncreated. This strange figure may correspond to the monogenes of Coptic Gnosis mentioned in the Codex Bruxianus. There are 2. The monogenes is characterized as the Quaternary Symbol. And as I said before, the number 4 plays an important role in these dreams, always alluding to an idea akin to the Pythagorean tetrarchies. The Quaternarium, or quaternity, has a long history. It appears not only in Christian iconology and mystical speculation, but plays perhaps a greater role in Gnostic philosophy. And from then on, down through the Middle Ages until well into the 18th century. In the dream under discussion, the quaternity appears as the most significant exponent of the religious cult created by the unconscious. The dreamer enters the house of the gathering alone, instead of with a friend as in the church dream. Here he meets an old man who had already appeared in an earlier dream as the sage who had pointed out a particular spot on the earth where the dreamer belonged. The old man explains the character of a cult as a purification ritual. It is not clear from the dream text what kind of purification is meant or from what it should purify. The only ritual that actually takes place seems to be concentration or meditation, leading up to the ecstatic phenomenon of the voice. The voice is a frequent occurrence in this dream series. It always utters an authoritative declaration or a command, either of astonishing common sense or profound philosophic import. It is nearly always a final statement, usually coming towards the end of the dream, and it is, as a rule, so clear and convincing that the dreamer finds no argument against it. It has, indeed, so much the character of the indisputable truth that it can hardly be understood as anything except a final trenchant summoning up a long process of unconscious deliberation and weighing of arguments. Frequently, the voice issues from an authoritative figure, such as a military commander or the captain of a ship, or an old physician. Sometimes, in this case, there's simply a voice coming apparently from nowhere. It was interesting to see how this very intellectual and a skeptical man accepted the voice. Often it did not suit him at all, yet he accepted it unquestioningly, even humbly. Thus, the voice revealed itself in the course of several hundred carefully recorded dreams as an important and even decisive spokesman of the unconscious. Since this patient is by no means the only one I have observed who exhibited the phenomenon of the voice in dreams and in other peculiar states of consciousness, I am forced to admit that the unconscious is capable at times of manifesting an intelligence and purposiveness superior to the actual conscious insight. There can be no doubt that this is a basic religious phenomenon observed here in a person whose conscious mental attitude certainly seems most unlikely to produce religious phenomena. I have not infrequently made similar observation in other cases, and I must confess that I am unable to formulate the facts in any other way. I have often met with the objection that the thoughts which the voice represents are no more than the thoughts of the individual himself. That may be, but I would call a thought of my own only when I have thought it, just as I would call money my own only when I earned or acquired it in a conscious and legitimate manner. If somebody gives me the money or as a present, then I shall certainly not say to my benefactor, quote, "Thank you for my money," unquote, although to a third person I might say afterwards, quote, "This is my own money," quote, unquote. With the voice I am in a singular situation, the voice gives me certain contents exactly as if a friend were informing me of his ideas. It would be neither decent nor truthful to suggest that what he says are my own ideas. This is the reason why I differentiate between what I have produced or acquired by my own conscious effort and what is clearly and unmistakably a product of the unconscious. Someone may object that the so-called unconscious mind is merely my own mind and that, therefore, such a differentiation is superfluous. But I am not at all convinced that the unconscious mind is merely my mind because the term quote-unquote unconscious means that I am not even conscious of it. As a matter of fact, the concept of the unconscious is an assumption for the sake of convenience. In reality, I am totally unconscious of, or in other words, I do not know at all where the voice comes from. Not only am I incapable of producing the phenomenon at will, I am unable to anticipate what the voice will say. Under such conditions, it would be presumptuous to refer to the factor that produces the voice as my unconsciousness, or my mind. This would not be accurate, to say the least. The fact that you perceive the voice in your dream proves nothing at all, for you can also hear the noises in the street, which you would never think of calling your own. There is only one condition under which you might legitimately call the voice your own, and that is when you assume your conscious personality to be part of a whole or to be a smaller circle contained in a bigger one. A little bank clerk showing a friend around town who points to the bank building with the words, quote, "And this is my bank," unquote, is making use of the same privilege. We may suppose that the human personality consists of two things. First, consciousness and whatever confers. The second, the indefinitely, First, the consciousness and whatever this confers, and second, the indefinitely large hinterland of unconscious psyche. So far as the former is concerned, it can be more or less clearly defined and delimited, but as for the sum total of the human personality, one has to admit the impossibility of a complete description or definition. In other words, there is bound to be an illimitable and indefinable addition to every personality, because the latter consists of a conscious and observable part of which does not contain certain factors whose existence, however, we are forced to assume in order to explain certain observable facts. The unknown factors form what we call unconscious part of the personality. Of what those factors consist, we have no idea, since we can observe only their effects. We may assume that they are of a psychic nature comparable to that of conscious content. And yet there is no certainty about this. But if we suppose such a likeness, we can hardly refrain from going further, since psychic contents are conscious and perceivable only when they are associated with an ego. The phenomenon of the voice, having a strongly personal character, may also issue from a center, but a center which is not identical with the conscious ego. Such reasoning is permissible if we conceive of the ego as being subordinate to or contained in a supraordinate self as center of the total, illimitable, and indefinable psychic personality. Say that 10 times fast. Excuse me. I do not enjoy philosophical arguments that amuse by their own complications. Although my arguments may seem abstruse, it is at least an honest attempt to formulate the observed facts. To put it simply, one could say, since we do not know everything, practically every experience, fact, or object contains something unknown. Hence, if we speak of the totality of an experience, the word quote-unquote totality can refer only to the conscious part of it. We cannot assume that our experience covers the totality of the object. It is clear that this absolute totality must necessarily contain the part that has not been experienced. The same holds true, as I have mentioned, of every experience and also of the psyche, whose absolute totality covers a greater area than consciousness. In other words, the psyche is no exception to the general rule that the universe can be established only so far as our psychic organism permits. My psychological experience has shown time and time again that certain contents issue from a psyche that is more complete than consciousness. They often contain a superior analysis or insight or knowledge which consciousness has not been able to produce. We have a suitable word for such occurrences: intuition. In uttering this word, most people have an agreeable feeling, as if something had been settled. But they never consider that you do not make an intuition. On the contrary, it always comes to you. Indeed. You have a hunch. It has come of itself, and you only catch it if you are clever or quick enough. Consequently, I explain the voice in the dream of the sacred house as a product of the more complete personality of which the dreamer's conscious self is a part, and I hold that this is the reason why the voice shows an intelligence and a clarity superior to the dreamer's actual consciousness. This superiority is the reason for the absolute authority of the voice. The message of the voice contains a strange criticism of the dreamer's attitude. In the church dream, he made an attempt to reconcile the two sides of life by a kind of cheap compromise. As we know, the unknown woman, the Anima, disagreed and left the scene. In the present dream, the voice seemed to have taken the place of the Anima, making not a merely emotional protest, but a masterful statement of two kinds of religions. According to this statement, the dreamer is inclined to use religion as a substitute for the quote woman's image, unquote. As the text says, the quote-unquote woman refers to the anima. This is borne out by the next sentence, which speaks of religion being used as a substitute for, quote, the other side of the soul's life, unquote. The anima is the, quote, other side, unquote, as I explained before. She is the representative of the female minority hidden below the threshold of consciousness, and that is to say, in the unconsciousness. The criticism, therefore, would read as follows, quote, you try religion in order to escape from your unconscious. You use it as a substitute for a part of your soul's life. But religion is the fruit and culmination of the completeness of life, that is, of a life which contains both sides, unquote. And I think, yeah, I'll continue. I had an interesting thought, but a careful comparison with other dreams of the same series shows unmistakably that the quote other side, what the quote other side is. The patient always tried to evade his emotional needs. As a matter of fact, he was afraid they might get him into trouble. For instance, into marriage and into other responsibilities such as love, devotion, loyalty, trust, emotional dependence, and general submission to the soul's needs. All this had nothing to do with science or an academic career. Moreover, the word soul was nothing but an intellectual obscenity, not fit to be touched with a barge pole. Interesting. The mystery of the anima is the mysterious allusion to religion. It was a great puzzle to my patient, who naturally enough knew nothing of religion except as a creed. He also knew that religion could be a substitute for certain awkward emotional demands which one might circumvent by going to church. These prejudices of our age are visibly reflected in the dreamer's apprehension. The voice, on the other hand, is unorthodox, indeed shockingly unconventional. It takes a religion seriously and puts it on the very apex of life, a life containing, quote-unquote, both sides, and thus upsets his most cherished intellectual and rationalistic prejudices. This was such a revolution that my patient was often afraid he would go crazy. Well, I should say that we, knowing the average intellectual of today and yesterday, can easily sympathize with his predicament. To take the quote-unquote woman's image In other words, the unconscious seriously into account what a blow to enlightened common sense. I began his personal treatment only after he had observed the first series of about 350 dreams. Then I got the whole backwash of his upsetting experiences. No wonder he wanted to run away from his adventure. But fortunately, the man had religio, that is, he, quote, carefully took account of, unquote, his experience, and he had enough Greek word, or loyalty to his experience to enable him to hang on to it and continue it. He had the great advantage of being neurotic, and so whenever he tried to be disloyal to his experience or to deny the voice, the neurotic condition instantly came back. He simply could not, quote, quench the fire, unquote. And finally, he had to admit the incomprehensibility, numinous character of his experience. He had to confess that the unquenchable fire was, quote unquote, holy. This was the sine qua non of his cure. One might perhaps consider this case an exception inasmuch as fairly complete human beings are exceptions. It is true that an overwhelming majority of educated people are fragmentary personalities and have a lot of substitutes instead of the genuine goods, but being like that means a neurosis for this man, and it means the same for a great many other people too. What is ordinarily called quote-unquote religion is a substitute to such an amazing degree that I ask myself seriously whether this kind of quote-unquote religion, which I prefer to call a creed, may not after all have an important function in human society. The substitute has the obvious purpose of replacing immediate experience by a choice of suitable symbols tricked out with an organized dogma and ritual. The Catholic Church maintains them by her indisputable authority. The Protestant Church, if this term is still applicable, by insistence on belief in the evangelical message. So long as these two principles work, people are effectively protected against immediate religious experience. Even if something of the sort should happen to them, they can refer to the Church, for she would know whether the experience came from God or from the devil, and whether it is to be accepted or rejected. In my profession, I have encountered many people who have had immediate experience and who would not and could not submit to the authority of ecclesiastical decision. I had to go to them through the crisis of passionate conflicts, through the panics of madness, through desperate confusion and depressions, which were grotesque and terrible at the same time, so that I am fully aware of the extraordinary importance of dogma and ritual, at least as methods of mental hygiene. If the patient is a practicing Catholic, I invariably advise him to confess and to receive communion in order to protect himself from immediate experience, which might easily prove too much for him. That's very interesting, isn't that? This whole idea of this immediate experience here. It's like people can't handle life, and they don't know how to handle life. And this is why they constantly come back to these things for meaning or for some kind of closure of some sort. This is fascinating. There's also a rule. There is also, as a rule, no confession, and the clergy share the common dislike of psychological problems and also, unfortunately, the common ignorance of psychology. The Catholic, quote, director of conscience, unquote, often has infinitely more psychological skill and insight. The Protestant parsons, moreover, have gone through a scientific training at the theological faculty, which, with its critical spirit, undermines a naivete of faith, whereas the powerful historical tradition in the Catholic priest training is apt to strengthen the authority of the institution. As a doctor, I might, of course, espouse the so-called quote-unquote scientific creed, holding that the contents of a neurosis are nothing but repressed infantile sexuality or will to power, but by thus depreciating these contents, it would be possible, up to a point, to shield a number of patients from the risks of immediate experience. But I know that this theory is only partially true, which means that it formulates only certain aspects of the neurotic psyche, and I cannot tell my patients what I myself do not fully believe. And here you see a huge split between him and Freud in the way that they think, which is why I like Jung way more than I have ever liked Freud. Now, people may ask me, but if you tell me you're practicing Catholic, go to the priest and confess, you are telling him something you do not believe. That is, assuming that I am a Protestant. In order to answer this critical question, I must first of all explain that if I can help it, I never preach my belief. If asked, I shall certainly stand by my convictions, but these do not go beyond what I consider to be my actual knowledge. I believe only what I know. Everything else is hypothesis, and beyond that, I can leave a lot of things to the unknown. Oh, you know what, guys? And if everyone just like took these two lines, especially people on YouTube in general, like, believe what you know. Everything else is hypothesis. Like, let things be as they are. Most people don't really know, quote unquote, much of anything. But man, do we really act like we think we know everything? And it's a big problem on the internet, in my opinion. I, of course, as you guys know, because I repeat myself constantly, I don't know lots of things. I also give out information because I think it's good to do that, and you guys make up your own minds. I like to give out the stuff, but in the end, like the dots are up to you to connect for yourself, because that's the only way you will learn anything for yourself is by doing it yourself. So, continuing, but I thought that was a very good point by him. I wanted to just reiterate. Where am I? But they would begin to bother me, I am sure, if I felt that I ought to know about them. If therefore a patient is convinced of the exclusively sexual origin of his neurosis, I would not disturb him in his opinion, because I know that such a conviction, particularly if it is deeply rooted, is an excellent defense against an onslaught of immediate experience with its terrible ambiguity. So long as such a defense works, I shall not break it down, since I know that there must be cogent reasons why the patient has to think in such a narrow circle. And, he's talking about this as doctor patient wise, but like, think about this also, guys, in terms of how how people connect to their belief systems and how hard they hold on to those things. Very much what he's saying here as well, this narrow circle of thinking. And it's not, you want to convince somebody and you understand that they do have a narrow circle of thinking, then you have to be creative, because they're not going to just let go of that kind of stuff. But if his dreams should begin to destroy the protective theory, I have to support the wider personality, as I have done in the case of the dream described. In the same way, and for the same reasons, I support the hypothesis of the practicing Catholic while it works for him. In either case, I reinforce a means of defense against a grave risk without asking the academic question whether the defense is an ultimate truth. I am glad when it works, so long as it works. With our patient, the Catholic defense had broken down long before I ever touched the case. He would have laughed at me if I had advised him to confess or anything of that sort, just as he laughed at the sexual theory, which he had no use for either. But I always let him see that I was entirely on the side of the voice, which I recognized as part of his future greater personality, destined to relieve him of his one-sidedness. For a certain type of intellectual mediocrity characterized by enlightened rationalism, a scientific theory that simplifies matters is a very good means of defense, because of the tremendous faith modern man has in anything which bears the label scientific. Such a label sets your mind at rest immediately, almost as well as the Roma locuta causa finita. Quote, Rome has spoken, the matter is settled. Unquote. In itself, any scientific theory, no matter how subtle, has, I think, less value from the standpoint of psychological truth than religious dogma, for the simple reason that a theory is necessarily highly abstract and exclusively rational, whereas dogma expresses an irrational whole by means of imagery. But it is also abstract. This guarantees a far better rendering of an irrational fact like the psyche. Moreover, dogma owes to its continued existence in its form, on the other hand, to so-called quote-unquote revealed or immediate experiences of the quote-unquote gnosis. For instance, the God-man, the cross, the virgin birth, the immaculate conception, the Trinity, and so on, and on the other hand, to the ceaseless collaboration of many minds over many centuries. It may not be quite clear why I call certain dogmas, quote, immediate experiences, unquote, since in itself a dogma is the very thing that precludes the immediate experience. Yet the Christian images I have mentioned are not peculiar to Christianity alone, although in Christianity they have undergone a development and intensification of meaning not to be found in any other religion. They occur just as often in pagan religion, and besides that, they can reappear spontaneously in all sorts of variations as psychic phenomena. Just as in the remote past they originated in visions, dreams, or trances, ideas like these are never invented. They came into being before man had learned to use his mind purposefully. Before man had learned Yet before man had learned to produce thoughts, thoughts came to him. He did not think, he perceived his mind functioning. Dogma is like a dream, reflecting the spontaneous and autonomous activity of the objective psyche, the unconscious, the unconscious. Such an expression of the unconscious is a much more efficient means of defense against further immediate experiences than any scientific theory. The theory has to disregard the emotional values of the experience. The dogma, on the other hand, is extremely eloquent in just this respect. One scientific theory is soon superseded by another. Dogma lasts for untold centuries. The suffering God-man may be at least 5,000 years old, and the Trinity probably even older. Yeah, indeed. Very, very true. Excuse me. Dogma expresses the soul more completely than a scientific theory, for the latter gives expression to and formulates the conscious mind alone. Furthermore, a theory can do nothing except formulate a living thing in abstract terms. Dogma, on the contrary, aptly expresses the living process of the unconscious in the form of the drama of repentance, sacrifice, redemption. It is rather astonishing from this point of view that the Protestant schism could not have been avoided, but since Protestantism became the creed of the adventurous Germanic tribes with their characteristic curiosity, acquisitiveness, and recklessness, it seems possible that their peculiar nature was unable to endure the peace of the Church, at least not for any length of time. It looks as if they were not yet advanced enough to suffer a process of salvation and to submit to a deity who was made visible in the magnificent structure of the Church. There was, perhaps, too much of the Imperium Romanum or the Rex Romana, Pax Romana in the Church, too much at least for their energies, which were and still are insufficiently domesticated. It is quite likely that they needed a unmitigated and less controlled experience of God, as often happens to adventurous and restless people, who are too youthful for any form of conservatism or domestication. They therefore did away with the intercession of the Church between God and man, and God and man, some more and some less. With the demolition of protective walls, the Protestant lost the sacred images that expressed important unconscious factors, together with the ritual which, from time immemorial, has been a safe way of dealing with unpredictable forces of the unconscious. A vast amount of energy was thus liberated and instantly went into the old channels of curiosity and acquisitiveness. In this way, Europe became the mother of dragons that devoured the great part of the earth. Mother of dragons, huh? Let me just really quickly, guys, make sure the sound is working great here. Yes, it is. Good. Excellent. All right. Sorry. Didn't mean for the break there. The mother of dragons. Since those days, Protestantism has become a hotbed of schisms, at the same time of rapid advances in science and techniques, which cast such a spell over man's conscious mind that it forgot the unpredictable forces of the unconscious. Good point. Just a very good point about how modernity has plowed through our spirituality and just buried it across the world. The catastrophe of the First World War and the extraordinary manifestations of profound spiritual malaise that came afterwards were needed to arouse a doubt as to whether all was well with the white man's mind. Before the war broke out in 1914, we were all quite certain the world would be righted by rational means. Now we behold the amazing spectacle of states taking over the age-old totalitarian claims of theocracy, which are inevitably accompanied by suppression of free opinion. What a very cogent and truthful statement there. Excuse me. Once more, we see people cutting each other's throats in support of childish theories of how to create paradise on earth. Oh my God, I love Carl Jung. It is not very difficult to see that the powers of the underworld, not to say of hell, which in former times were more or less successfully chained up in a gigantic spiritual edifice where they could be of some use, are now creating or trying to create a state slavery in a state prison devoid of any mental or spiritual charm. There are not a few people nowadays who are convinced that mere human reason is not entirely up to the enormous task, enormous task of putting a lid on the volcano. Wow. This whole development is fate. I would not lay the blame either on Protestantism or the Renaissance, but one thing is certain, that modern man, Protestant or otherwise, has lost the protection of the ecclesiastical walls erected and reinforced so carefully since the Roman days, and because of this loss has approached the zone of world-destroying and world-creating fire. Life has become quickened and intensified. Our world is shot through with waves of uneasiness. Yes, of uneasiness and fear. Our world is shot through with waves of uneasiness and fear. And I can't, has it really changed since that happened? I don't think so. Protestantism was and still is a great risk, and at the same time a great opportunity. If it goes on disintegrating as a church, it must have the effect of stripping man of all his spiritual safeguards and means of defense against immediate experience of the forces waiting for liberation in the unconscious. Look at all the incredible savagery going on in our so-called civilized world. It all comes from human beings and the spiritual condition they are in. My God. This is so good. Look at the devilish engines of destruction. They are invented by completely innocuous gentlemen, reasonable, respectable citizens who are everything we could wish. And when the whole thing blows up and an indescribable hell of destruction is let loose, nobody seems to be responsible. Bravo. Bravo, Dr. Jung. It has simply happened. It simply happens, and yet it is all man-made. But since everybody is blindly convinced that he is nothing more than his own extremely unassuming and insignificant conscious self, which performs its duties decently and earns a moderate living, nobody is aware that this whole rationalistically organized conglomeration we call a state or a nation is driven on by a seemingly impersonal, invisible, but terrifying power which nobody and nothing can check. And I would say that we have the same problem in the United States today. Even just the idea of the government being completely, a power, an unchecked power that we have nothing, we can't do anything about it, which I think is a lie, but whatever. This ghastly power is mostly explained as a fear of the neighboring nation, which is supposed to be possessed by a malevolent fiend, which, since nobody is capable of recognizing just where and how much he himself is possessed and unconscious, he simply projects his own condition upon his neighbor. God. And thus it becomes a sacred duty to have the biggest guns and the most poisonous gas. Oh my God. The worst of it is that he is quite right. All one's neighbors are in the grip of some uncontrollable fear, just like oneself. In lunatic asylums, it is well known fact that patients are far more dangerous when suffering from fear than when moved by rage or hatred. The Protestant is left to God alone for him. And this whole thing here, this whole paragraph talking about this, like, if you really think about the ideas of as above, so below, you guys, as above, the thinking, the mass ideas and the mass accepted thinking that people do give rise to these wars and the acceptance of these wars and the acceptance of the absurd idea of going through these wars, and they use fear as a tool to use that, obviously, or maybe it's not so obvious to some people. The Protestant is left to God alone. For him there is no confession, no absolution, no possibility of an expiatory opus divinum of any kind. He has to digest his sins by himself, and because the absence of a suitable ritual has put it beyond his reach, he is none too sure of divine grace. Hence the present alertness of the Protestant conscience is bad and this bad conscious has all the disagreeable characteristics of a lingering illness which makes people chronically uncomfortable. But for this very reason, the Protestant has a unique chance to make himself conscious of sin to a degree that is hardly possible for a Catholic mentality, as confession and absolution are always at hand to ease the excess of tension. The Protestant, however, is left to his tensions, which can go on sharpening his conscience. The conscience, and particularly a bad conscience, can be a gift from heaven, a veritable grace if used in the interest of the higher self-criticism. Oh, I agree with this. And self-criticism, which is so important, guys, is the sense of an introspective, discriminating activity. It is indispensable in any attempt to understand your own psychology. If I can just highlight that, and that is absolutely true. And really, that is like understanding that is the first step of really doing anything spiritual. So continuing, if you have done something that puzzles you and you ask yourself what could have prompted you such an action, you need the sting of a bad conscience and its discriminating faculty in order to discover the real motive of your behavior. It is only then that you can see what motives are governing your actions. The sting of a bad conscience even spurs you on to discover things that were unconscious before. And in this way, you may be able to cross the threshold of the unconscious and take cognizance of those impersonal forces which make you an unconscious instrument of the wholesale murderer in man. Very, very good point. For Protestant survives complete loss of his church and still remains Protestant, that is to say, a man who is defenseless against God and no longer shielded by walls or community, he has a unique spiritual opportunity for immediate religious experience. I do not know whether I have succeeded in conveying what the experience of the unconscious meant to my patient. There is, however, no objective criterion by which an experience can be valued. We have to take it for what it's worth to the person who has the experience. Thus, you may be impressed by the fact that the apparent futility of certain dreams should mean something to an intelligent person. But if you cannot accept what he says, or if you cannot put yourself in his place, you should not judge his case. Agreed. I agree with that. The genius religiosus is a wind that bloweth where it listeth. There is no Archimedean point from which to judge, since the psyche is indistinguishable from its manifestations. The psyche is the object of psychology, and fatally enough, so also its subject. There is no getting away from this fact. The few dreams I have chosen as examples of what I call quote-unquote immediate experience certainly look very insignificant to the unpracticed eye. They are not spectacular and are only modest witnesses to an individual experience. They would cut a better figure if I could present them in their sequence together with the wealth of symbolic material that was brought up in the course of the entire process. But even the sum total of the dreams in the series could not compare in beauty and expressiveness with any part of a traditional religion. A dogma is always the result and fruit of many minds in many centuries, purified of all the oddities, shortcomings, and flaws of individual experience. But for all that, the individual experience, by its very poverty, is immediate life, the warm red blood of pulsating today. It is more convincing to a seeker after truth than the best tradition. It is more convincing to a seeker after truth than the best tradition. Yeah, I agree. Immediate life is always individual, since the carrier of life is the individual. Whatever emanates from the individual is in a way unique, and hence transitory and imperfect, particularly when it comes to spontaneous psychic products such as dreams and the like. No one else will have the same dreams, although many have the same problem. But just as no individual is differentiated to the point of absolute uniqueness, so there are no individual products of absolutely unique qualities. Even dreams are made of collective material to a very high degree, just as in the mythology and folklore of different peoples, certain motifs repeat themselves in most identical form. I have called these motifs archetypes. And by this I mean forms or images of a collective nature which occur practically all over the earth as constituents of myths at the same time as this is a tough word. Adochthonous individual products of unconscious origin. But archetypes are definitely very important, and Jung did a masterful job with, with creating these motifs of archetypes. Continuing. The archetypal motifs presumably derive from patterns of the human mind that are transmitted not only by tradition and migration, but also by heredity. The latter hypothesis is indispensable since even complicated archetypal images can be reproduced spontaneously without there being any possibility of direct tradition. The theory of preconscious primordial ideas is by no means my own invention, as the term archetype, which stems from the first centuries of our era proves, with special reference to psychology. We find this theory in the works of Adolphe Bastaine, and then again in Nietzsche. In French literature, Hubert and Mauss, also Lévi-Brühl, mentioned similar ideas. I only gave an empirical foundation to the theory of what were formerly called primordial or elementary ideas, categories, or habitudes directrices de la conscience, or representations collectives, by setting out and to investigate certain details. In the second of the dreams discussed above, we met with an archetype which I have not yet considered. This is the peculiar arrangement of the burning candles in four pyramid-like points. The arrangement emphasizes the symbolic importance of the number 4 by putting it in place of the altar or iconostasis, where one would expect to find the sacred images. Since the temple is called the, quote, house of the gathering, unquote, we may assume that this character is expressed if the image or symbols appear in the place of worship. And then there's this whole section here about the term archetypus, used by Cicero, Pliny, and others. And it appears also in the Corpus Hermeticum, which we'll be reading at some point. Okay. The Tetrarchies, to use the Pythagorean term, Phoenician, of course, does indeed refer to an, quote, inner gathering, unquote. As our patient's dream clearly demonstrates, the symbol appears in other dreams, usually in the form of a circle divided into 4 or containing 4 main parts. In other dreams of the same series, it takes the form of an undivided circle, a flower, a square, a place or a room, a quadrangle, a globe, a clock, a symmetrical garden with a fountain in the center, 4 people in a boat, an aeroplane, or at a table, 4 chairs around a table, 4 colors, a wheel with 8 spokes, an 8-rayed star or sun, a round hat divided in 8 parts, a bear with 4 eyes, a square prison cell, the 4 seasons, a bowl containing 4 nuts, the world clock with a disc divided into 4 by 8 equals 32 partitions, and so on. These quaternity symbols occur no less than 71 times in a series of 400 dreams. My case is no exception in this respect. I have observed many cases where the number of 4 occurred and it always had an unconscious origin. That is, the dreamer got it first from a dream and had no idea of its meaning, nor had he ever heard of the symbolic importance of the number 4. It would, of course, be a different thing with the number 3, since the Trinity represents a symbolic number known to everybody. But for us, particularly for a modern scientist, 4 conveys no more than another number. Number symbolism and its venerable history is a field of knowledge completely outside our dreamer's intellectual interests. If under such conditions dreams insist upon the importance of 4, we have every right to call its origins unconscious one. The numinous character of the quaternity is obvious in the second dream. From this, we must conclude that it points to a meaning which we have to call, quote unquote, sacred. Since the dreamer was unable to trace this peculiar character to any conscious source, I apply a comparative method in order to elucidate the meaning of the symbolism. It is, of course, impossible to give a complete account of this procedure here, so I must restrict myself to the barest hints. Remember, this is a lecture that I'm reading. Since many unconscious contents seem to be remnants of historical states of mind, we need only go back a few hundred years in order to reach the conscious level that forms the parallel to our dreams. Pardon me for a second. In our case, we step back not quite 300 years and find ourselves among scientists and natural philosophers who are seriously discussing the enigma of squaring the circle. This abstruse problem was itself a psychological projection of something much older and completely unconscious, but they knew in those days that the circle signified the deity. Quote, God is an intellectual form whose center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere, unquote. As one of these philosophers said, repeating St. Augustine, a man as introverted and introspective as Emerson could hardly fail to touch on the same idea and likewise quote St. Augustine. The image of the circle, regarded as the most perfect form since Plato's Timaeus, the prime authority for Hermetic philosophy, was assigned to the most perfect substance, to the gold, also to the anima mundi or anima media natura, and to the first created light. Because the macrocosm, the great world, was made by the Creator, quote, in a form round and globose, unquote, the smallest part of the whole, the point also possesses this perfect nature, as the philosopher says, quote, all of the shapes, the simplest and most perfect is the sphere which rests in a point, unquote. This image of the deity, dormant and concealed in matter, was what the alchemists called the original chaos, or the earth of paradise, or the round fish in the sea, or the egg, exactly, the egg, or simply the rotundum. That round thing was in possession of the magical key which unlocked the closed doors of matter. And this is why we have the mound, I believe it's in Ohio, the snake, the mound of the snake eating the egg, which actually comes from Phoenicians, believe it or not. We'll get into that in future videos. So continuing, as is said in the Timaeus, only the demiurge, the perfect being, is capable of dissolving the tetrarchies, the embrace of the four elements. One of the great authorities since the 13th century, the Turba Philosophorum, says that the rotundum can dissolve copper into four. Thus, the much sought for aurum philosophicum was round. Opinions were divided as to the procedure for the procuring of the dormant demiurge. Some hoped to lay hold of him in the form of the prima materia, containing a peculiar concentration or a peculiarly suitable variety of this substance. Others endeavored to produce the round substance by a sort of a synthesis called the conjunctio, okay. The anonymous author of the Rosarium Philosophorum says, make a round circle of a man and a woman, extract therefrom a quadrangle, and from it a triangle. Make the circle round, and you will have the philosopher's stone. Sounds like Rosicrucians there. This marvelous stone was symbolized as a perfect living being of hermaphroditic nature, corresponding to the Empedoclean, the Greek word, looks like it says eos, evangelite, something or other, eos, an all-around bisexual being in Plato. As early as the beginning of the 14th century, the lapis was compared by Petrus Bonus to Christ as an allegoria Christi. In the Aurea Hora, a pseudo-Thomist tract from the 13th century, the mystery of the stone is related even higher than the mysteries of the Christian religion. I mention these facts merely to show that the circle or globe containing the four was an allegory of the deity for not a few of our learned forefathers. Pardon me for a second. Might be time for some more syrup. From the Latin treatises, it is also evident that the latent demiurge, dormant and concealed in matter, is identical with the so-called Homo philosophicus, the second Adam. He is a spiritual man, Adam Kadmon, often identified with Christ, whereas the original Adam was mortal because he was made of the corruptible four elements. The second Adam is immortal because he consists of one pure and incorruptible essence. Thus, excuse me. Thus, Pseudo-Thomas says, the, quote, second Adam passed from the pure elements into eternity. Therefore, since he consists of a simple and pure essence, he endures forever, unquote. The same treatise quotes the Latinized Arabic author called Signor, a famous authority throughout the Middle Ages, as saying, quote, there is one substance which never dies because it abides in continued increase, and interprets this substance as the second Adam. Pardon me. It is clear from these quotations that the round substance searched for by the philosophers was a projection very similar to our own dream symbolism. We have historical documents which prove that dreams, vision, and even hallucinations were often mixed up with the great philosophic opus. Our forefathers, being even more naively constituted than ourselves, projected their unconscious contents directly into matter. Matter, however, could easily take up such projections because at that time it was practically unknown and incomprehensible entity. Excuse me. And whenever man encounters something mysterious, he projects his own assumptions onto it without the slightest self-criticism. Isn't that the truth? But since chemical matter nowadays is something we know fairly well, we can no longer project as freely as our ancestors. We have at least to admit that the tetrarchy is something psychic, and we do not yet know whether, in a more or less distant future, this too may not prove to be a projection. For the time being, we must be satisfied with the fact that the idea of God, which is entirely absent from the conscious mind of modern man, returns in a form known consciously 300 or 400 years ago. Okay, guys, just real quick, I have to take some syrup. I'll be right back, okay? All right. I apologize for that, guys. Trying to get over this cold I had last week. Hasn't been easy. Yes. And, but since, yep, okay, we have at last to admit that the tetrarchy is something psychic, and we do not yet know whether in a more. Yeah, sorry, I already read that. I do not need to emphasize that this piece of history was completely unknown to my dreamer. One could say with the classical poet, naturarum expels. Okay, there we go. With a classical poet, drive out nature with a pitchfork and she always turns up again. Excuse me. The idea of those old philosophers was that God manifested himself first in the creation of the four elements. They were symbolized by the four partitions of the circle. Thus we read in a Coptic treatise of the Codex Borisianus concerning the only begotten monogenes, or anthropos. Quoting, I think, yeah, yep. Quoting, this same is he who dwelleth in the monad, which is in the Cetheus creator, and which came from the place of which none can say where it is. From him it is the monad came, and in the manner of a ship laden with all good things, and in the manner of a field filled or planted with every kind of tree, and in the manner of a city filled with all races of mankind, and to its veil which surroundeth it in the manner of a defence where there are 12 gates. This same is the mother city of the only begotten. Unquote. In another place, the Anthropos himself is the city, and his members are the four gates. The monad is a spark of light, an atom of the deity. The monogenes is thought of as standing upon the Greek word, a platform supported by four pillars corresponding to the Christian quaternarium of the evangelists or to the tetramorph. the symbolic steed of the church, composed of the symbols of the four evangelists, the angel, eagle, ox, calf, and lion. And we certainly see all four of those in all kinds of symbology all over the world, and also all over architecture, right? The analogy with the New Testament, the analogy with the New Jerusalem of the Apocalypse is obvious. The division into four, the synthesis of the four, the miraculous appearance of the four colors of the four stages of the work, nigredo, delbatio, rubefactio, and citrinitas are constant preoccupations of the old philosophers. Four symbolizes the parts, qualities, and aspects of the one. But why should my patient recapitulate these old speculations? I do not know why he should. I only know that this is not an isolated case. Many others under my observation or under that of my colleagues have spontaneously produced the same symbolism. I naturally do not think that it originated 300 or 400 years ago. That was simply another epoch when this same archetypal idea was very much in the foreground. As a matter of fact, it is much older than the Middle Ages, as the Timaeus proves, nor is it a classical or Egyptian heritage, since it is to be found practically everywhere and in all ages. One has only to remember, for instance, how great importance was attributed to the quaternity by the American Indians. Although the quaternity is an age-old and presumably prehistoric symbol, always associated with the idea of world-creating deity, it is, curiously enough, rarely understood as such by those moderns in whom it occurs. I have always been particularly interested to see how people, if left to their own devices and not informed about the history of the symbol, would interpret it to themselves. I was careful, therefore, not to disturb them with my own opinions, and as a rule I discovered that they took it to symbolize themselves, or rather something in themselves. How interesting. They felt it belonged intimately to themselves as a sort of creative background, a life-producing sun in the depths of the unconscious, though it was easy to see that the certain mandala drawings that were almost an exact replica of Ezekiel's vision. It very seldom happened that peoples recognized the analogy even when they knew the vision, which knowledge, by the way, is pretty rare nowadays. What one could almost call a systematic blindness is simply the effect of the prejudice that God is outside man. Although this prejudice is not exclusively Christian, there are certain religions which do not share it at all. On the contrary, they insist, as do certain Christian mystics, on the essential identity of God and man, either in the form of a priori identity or of a goal to be attained by certain practices or initiations, as known to us, for instance, from the metamorphosis of Apuleius, not to speak of certain yoga methods. The use of comparative methods show without a doubt that the quaternity is a more or less direct representation of the God who is manifest in his creation. We might therefore conclude that the symbol spontaneously produced in the dreams of modern people means something similar to the God within. Yep. Although the majority of the persons concerned do not recognize this analogy, the interpretation might nevertheless be correct. I would say it is. If we consider that the fact that the idea of God is an quote unscientific unquote hypothesis, we can easily explain why people have forgotten to think along such lines. Even if they do cherish a certain belief in God, they would be deterred from the idea of a God within by their religious education, which has always depreciated this idea as quote unquote mystical. Exactly. Yet it is precisely this mystical idea which is forced upon the conscious mind by dreams and visions. I myself, as well as my colleagues, have seen so many cases developing the same kind of symbolism that we cannot doubt its existence any longer. My observation, moreover, date back to 1914, and I waited 14 years before alluding to them publicly. Wow. It would be a regrettable mistake if anybody should take my observations as a kind of proof of the existence of God. They prove only the existence of an archetypal God image, which to my mind is the most we can assert about God psychologically. But as it is a very important and influential archetype, its relatively frequent occurrence seems to be a noteworthy fact for any theologia naturalis, and since natural theology, right? And since experience of this archetype has the quality of numinosity, often in very high degree, it comes into the category of religious experiences. I cannot refrain from calling attention to the interesting fact that whereas the central Christian symbolism is a trinity, the formula presented by the unconscious is a quaternity. The reality, the Orthodox Christian formula is not quite complete. So, in reality, the Orthodox Christian formula is not quite complete because the dogmatic aspect of the evil principle is absent from the Trinity and leads a more or less awkward existence on its own as the devil. Oh man, that is so good. Nevertheless, it seems that the Church does not exclude an inner relationship between the devil and the Trinity. Catholic authority expresses himself on this question as follows, quote, "The existence of Satan, however, can only be understood in relation to the Trinity," unquote. And, quote, "Any theological treatment of the devil that is not related to God's Trinitarian consciousness is a falsification of the actual position," unquote. I agree. I would 100% agree with this. According to this view, the devil possesses personality. Not this part, not the second part. According to the Christian view, right? Shit, where did I go? According to this view, the devil possesses personality and absolute freedom. That is why he can be the true and personal, quote, counterpart of Christ, unquote. Quote, "Herein is revealed a new freedom in God's being. He freely allows the devil to subsist beside him and permits his kingdom to endure forever," unquote. The idea of a mighty devil is incompatible with the conception of Yahweh, but not with the conception of the Trinity. The mystery of the one God in three persons opens out a new freedom in depths of God's being, and this even makes possible the thought of a personal devil existing alongside God in opposition to him. The devil, accordingly, possesses an autonomous personality, freedom, and eternality, and he has these metaphysical qualities so much in common with God that he can actually subsist in opposition to him. Hence, the relationship or even the negative affinity of the devil with the Trinity can no longer be denied as a Catholic idea. Yep, that's true. That's absolutely true. The devil is 100% this Catholic idea of it being separate. It's, I don't think that's a shame because it divorces the responsibility of dealing with the evil side of ourselves, at least. So continuing, the inclusion of the devil in the quaternity is by no means a modern speculation or a monstrous fabrication of the unconscious. We find in the writings of the 16th century natural philosopher and physician Gerard Dorn a detailed discussion of the symbols of the Trinity and the quaternity, the latter being attributed to the devil. Dorn breaks with the whole alchemical tradition inasmuch as he adopts the rigidly Christian standpoint that three is one but four is not, because four attains to unity in the quinta essentia. According to this author, the quaternity is in truth a, quote, diabolical fraud, unquote, or a deception of the devil, unquote, and he holds that at the fall of the angels, the devil, quote, fell into the realm of quaternity and the elements, unquote, in quaternity. He also gives an elaborate description of the symbolic operation whereby the devil produces the, quote, double serpent, unquote, the number 2 with the 4 horns, the number 4. Indeed, the number 2 is the devil himself, the quatricornutus binarius. How interesting. Who knew the creation of the devil was such a complicated thing? Since a God identical with the individual man is an exceedingly complex assumption bordering on heresy, the, quote, God within also, unquote, also represents a dogmatic difficulty. But the quaternity, as produced by the modern psyche, points directly not only to the God within, but to the identity of God and man. How fascinating. So you realize that this quaternity thing, shows up in all these people's dreams over and over and over and over again. Might be part of that spiritual center that we are trying to ignore. Continuing, contrary to the dogma, there are not 3 but 4 aspects. It could easily be inferred that the 4th represents the devil, though we have the logion, and, quote, I and the Father are one, who seeth me seeth the Father, unquote. It would be considered blasphemy or madness to stress Christ's dogmatic humanity to such a degree that a man could identify himself with Christ and his homusia. But this is precisely what seems to be meant by the natural symbol from an orthodox standpoint. Therefore, the natural quaternity could be declared a diabolical farce, and the chief proof of this would be its assimilation of the church of the fourth aspect, which represents the reprehensible part of the Christian cosmos. The church, it seems to me, probably has to repudiate any attempt to take such conclusions seriously. Excuse me. She may even have to condemn any approach to these experiences, since she cannot admit that nature unites what she herself has divided. The voice of nature is clearly audible in all experiences of the Quaternity, and this arouses all the old mistrust of anything even remotely connected with the unconscious. Scientific investigation of dreams is simply the old oniromancy, okay, in new guise, and therefore just as objectionable as any other of the quote-unquote occult arts. Those parallel to the symbolism of the dreams can be found in the old alchemical treatises, and these are quite as heretical as dreams. Here, it would seem, was reason enough for secrecy and protective metaphors. The symbolic statements of those of old alchemists issue from the same conscious or same unconscious as the modern dreams are just as much the voice of nature. If we were still living in a medieval setting where there was not much doubt about the ultimate things, and where every history of the world began with Genesis, we could easily brush aside dreams and the like. Unfortunately, we live in a modern setting where all the ultimate things are doubtful, where there is a prehistory of enormous extension, and where people are fully aware that if there isn't any numinous experience at all, it is the experience of the psyche. We can no longer imagine an Empyrean world revolving around the throne of God, and we could not dream of seeking for him somewhere behind the galactic systems. Yet the human soul seems to harbor mysteries, since to an empiricist all religious experience boils down to a peculiar psychic condition. If we want to know anything of what religious experience means to those who have it, we have every chance nowadays of studying it in every imaginable form. And if it means anything, it means everything to those who have it. This is, at any rate, the inevitable conclusion one reaches by a careful study of the evidence. One could even define religious experience as that of being experience which is accorded the highest value. No matter what its contents may be, the modern mind, so far as it stands under the verdict, quote, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, unquote, will return to the psyche as the last hope. Where else could one obtain experience? Good question. And the answer will be more or less of the kind which I have described. The voice of nature will answer, and all those concerned with the spiritual problem of man will be confronted with new and baffling problems. Because of the spiritual need of my patients, I have been forced to make a serious attempt to understand some of the symbols produced by the unconscious. As it would lead much too far to embark on a discussion of the intellectual and ethical consequences, I shall have to content myself with a mere sketch. The main symbolic figures of a religion are always expressive of the particular moral and mental attitude involved. I would mention, for instance, the cross and its various religious meanings. Another main symbol is the Trinity. It is of exclusively masculine character. The unconscious, however, transforms it into quaternity, which is at the same time as a unity, just as the three persons of the Trinity are one in the same God. The natural philosophers of antiquity represented the Trinity so far as it was a imaginata in natura as the three Greek word, or spirits, also called volatilia, namely water, air, and fire. The fourth constituent, on the other hand, was another Greek word, the earth or the body. So I'm sure, I guess this means something about materialist. They symbolize the latter by the Virgin. In this way, they added the feminine element to the physical trinity, whereby producing the quaternity, or circulus quadratus, whose symbol was the hermaphroditic rebus, the filius sapiente. The natural philosophers of the Middle Ages undoubtedly meant earth and woman by the fourth element. The principle of evil was not openly mentioned, but it appears in the poisonous quality of the prima materia and in other allusions. The quaternity in modern dreams is a creation of the unconscious, as I explained in the first chapter. The unconscious is often personified by the anima of feminine figure. Apparently, the symbol of the quaternity it issues from her. She would be the matrix of the quaternity, A or A. Greek word, or mater Dei, just as the earth was understood to be the mother of God. But since a woman, as well as evil, is excluded from the deity in the dogma of the Trinity, the element of evil would form part of the religious symbol if the latter should be a quaternity. It needs no particular effort of imagination to guess the far-reaching spiritual consequences of such a development. Okay. History and psychology. Let's see how far this goes real quick, guys. What are we on? Page 84. I wanted to see if I can get up to the part where I actually already read the part about the whole chapter about the Quaternity. But it looks like it's going to be a lot of pages here. Okay, so I might end it here. Yeah. Let's see here. Okay, 84 pages. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to end it here, guys. I'm sorry. Let's see here. Go back to the page I was at. Oh, I'm here. Okay. All right, so I'll throw a bookmark on this. And we will come back to this book tomorrow, more than likely. So I do appreciate you guys joining me today, and hopefully you guys got something interesting out of the book. I thought this book is very fascinating, very interesting. Definitely throws out a lot of I don't know, psychological understandings of spirituality, dogma, things like that, dreams, people. It's just one of those things where I appreciate his viewpoint on these things. And I like Jung because he isn't so rigid as Freud and a lot of these other guys are, and has always been fascinated with the unknown, so to speak. So I really thought that was kind of really cool. And otherwise, if you guys enjoy the video and you enjoy these audiobooks, please consider liking and sharing and subscribing. And if you really do enjoy the work that we do, please consider donating. Our PayPal's and our Patreon links and stuff like that are in the description box. But either way, thanks yet again for coming out and joining me on this audiobook reading. I hope you guys really enjoyed it. I tried to do my best job, and in between the frog that got cut in my throat there. So I apologize for the coughing and all that stuff. Hopefully it won't be too bad tomorrow. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. I love all of you guys, and peace.